One race from the same place that make the same trip on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region. For we women and we children. That must be the ambition of the Caribbean and the Caribbean and the Caribbean.
And a very good evening to you and welcome to today's edition of Politics 101, the open word edition of Politics 101. Professor Clive Thomas will be here along with Dr. Dennis Canterbury and Rohit Kanhai, who are both executive members of the Working People's Alliance. Rohit Kanhai is one of the co-leaders. Wherever you're joining us from, whether you're joining us from in Guyana, out of Guyana, welcome to Politics 101. Some of you, I know, are still recovering from the the defeat of the Vice President Kamala Harris in the American elections. And of course, so many of us are disappointed. But life goes on, and we have to continue to do the work that is needed to ensure that our electorates become much more informed on these issues so they can make choices that are based on that information. If you're joining us from Canada, good evening to you. Good evening to you, and welcome to Politics 101, the open word edition. Well, you know, sugar has been in the news quite a lot, and it has been revealed that we are coming to the end of the year, and my God, not even 40% of the target has been met, and the government continues to pump billions and billions of dollars into the sugar industry. The Working People's Alliance has called for a commission of inquiry, a new commission of inquiry into the sugar industry to determine where it is and what measures need to be taken. But that issue, the union, GAWU, has said that it is concerned, and this is a PPP union. The PPP itself has been quiet on the issue. Guy Suko has not said anything. So we are going to talk a little bit about that. The cash handout, 100,000 by the PPP, continues to dominate the news also. As you all know, the government decided that it is going to give the handout to all Guyanese. And Professor Clive Thomas, a couple of weeks ago, said all Guyanese, according to their definition, means voters. And he was proven correct when we got word from GCOM that the Minister of Finance, the Ministry of Finance, has requested the voters list. And they said that is the list that they are going to use to distribute the $100,000. Now, as we know, that list is a bloated list. That list is riddled with dead people who've died overseas, cannot be verified, and so forth. And that is the list that is going to be used to distribute the money. What are the implications there? What can happen with the government using the voters list to distribute this cash handout? Want to be careful, cash handout. It is becoming patently clear to people as we continue to have these discussions that the original proposal by Professor Clive Thomas is not the framework that is being used for these payouts by the government. And we are glad about that. And we want to continue to make a clear distinction between cash transfers as a form of a basic income, as opposed to throwing a little money here and there to people. It is important because we sounded a warning here that when the government said each individual, including Guyanese who live outside of Guyana, we smelt something. And we are glad that the conversation is unfolding. Barra Jagdeo continues to spin, outright lying, and you know that we have dealt with him here, is misrepresentation of Professor Thomas. As you all said, with all the cards that you all, my house is full with cards of congratulations for the way I took him on a week ago. Thank you all for giving us your feedback. I notice Clement, you're on, Joyce, David, someone is joining us here from Johannesburg in South Africa. Welcome to today's edition of Politics 101, or Open Word edition. Let me bring in our guests for tonight, Rohit Kanhai, Dr. Dennis Canterbury, and Professor Clive Thomas. Gentlemen, good evening and welcome to today's edition of Politics 101.
Good evening, David.
Good evening, Dr. Hayes.
Good evening, David.
Thank you all very much for coming on. The cash transfer proposal continues to dominate the news as people begin to make the distinction between what is a cash transfer as a form of basic income and handouts that are given to people. Professor Thomas, you a couple of weeks ago hit the nail on the head when you said that $100,000 per individual is really a payment to voters. Since then, we have heard that the government has requested the voters list from GCOM, and it is that voters list that they're going to use to distribute the resource, distribute the $100,000. What are the dangers of that, Professor Thomas?
There are many dangers, David, but I would emphasize a couple of them. First of all, we know that traditionally, that voters list that we have at GCOM is a bloated list. It's a list that carries many dead bodies, people that we will never ever see again walking the streets of Guyana. And I think that it's an abomination because it allows room for using and abusing padding of that list. The second thing, and probably more important, is that the list does not find an original basis in any social category that we can think of in Guyana other than voters. It does not speak to the family. It does not speak to the household. It does not speak to any group within the community that is not a voter. So from that point of view, I think it narrows the scope and the intention and the purpose and the philosophy behind the universal basic income, which is to make people feel that they're entitled to a basic income around which they can build their lives, seek opportunities, and try to move forward, both as human beings and as members of an extended family. So I sort of condemn the list primarily on the basis that lacks a social unit as the basis of its calculation. It's based on who can vote, and because of that, it allows for political manipulation and for the tendency for it to become nothing more than a handout. Once it's a handout, it becomes the possibility that what leads us is the government's intentions and not the needs of the people in Guyana. I also believe that because it's going to be such an important, or should be such an important, socially based unit that guides its operation, that it should be rooted in law, it should be fixed, it should be time-based, so unbound, so that we know and people can plan their lives around it. Not something that comes before an election. And if then another election has to be called because of an emergency, let's say 2026, you give another one. If another election is not called until 2030 when it's due, then you offer the next one. You have to make it a regular basis on which people can plan their lives who are in extreme poverty. Because unless they have that capacity to have a control of some assets, productive assets, finance, that they could use in the marketplace to buy them and offer them opportunities to expand and their opportunities as workers, investors, and their needs of the family, whether in health, education, nutrition, then you will not have a basis for improving social life. So I think that we've taken those couple of points into consideration. I feel that what the government has done is a grave disservice to Guyanese and a vulgar abuse of the sort of philosophy of building trust and harmony within our society that the universal basic income is aiming at.
Professor Thomas, let me stay with you for because you raised the question of legislating cash transfers, and the vice president dismissed that suggestion, which was amplified by a letter from our colleague, Brother U.C. Guyana, a week ago. And Vice President Jack Dio retorted that you can't legislate recurring expenditures. Can you speak to that for us?
What we can legislate, which we all know, is that if you're spending public's money, it's the responsibility of those politicians who want to spend it to get the approval of Parliament. And if you can't get parliamentary approval for it, you can't spend it. So it is very easy to write that into law. Any law-based society, that would be a normal expectation. You don't go spending millions of dollars on a fly-by-night idea of some minister looking for votes. You have to root it in law that so people can know that an institution and legality backs their claims, so they're not become dependent on a handout, but they're making a legitimate claim that the law entitles them to make for the payout.
Dr. Thomas, the president is saying that this thing is going to cost a minimum of $60 billion. Now
that is calculating it at $1 million, Guyana,
right,
per person, and he's deliberately lying. I mean, yeah. I've never seen a grosser attempt to mislead than that in my life. Barefacedly, he said that what we're recommending is $1 million per person each year, when we have said $1 million per family each year. And we know the average family is about 4 to 5 persons per household.
Yes. Yes,
so
the World Bank.
He's not just doubling it, not
right.
tripling it, not quadrupling it, he's multiplying it 5-fold. The man is a scamp of enormous proportions.
Scamp of enormous proportions. See why that sum of money was not a line item in the budget. It's not a line.
All the more reason for law.
Yeah, and that's where I'm coming. I'm coming to. It's not a line item in the budget. They have not gone back to Parliament and asked for money to fund this thing. Where is that money coming from?
They can take it from the Treasury. And that is why we have to be thinking of legal means for challenging it. I don't think we should let the battle lie or leave it hanging in the air. If they break the law, if they violate tradition and custom, we should mobilize politically to challenge it in whatever forum we're allowed to do it. And I think it may be we have to speak to the legal people. There might be a legal case that we can make or a legal challenge that it has to get the approval of Parliament.
Professor Clive Thomas here, discussing some of the pertinent issues. As you all can see, they have opened a can of worms, and it's up to us to ensure that we hold them accountable, because what begins as an innocent intervention could well become...
I would say not innocent. Not what begins as a fraudulent intervention becomes exposed, and its ramifications for the rest of society become exposed to the sunlight, and then people see what is happening. And this is the way that we make progress, because we take the legal or other action that is required, political and otherwise, to remedy this situation. This is the way in which we make progress. Nobody going to try that again if we stop them this time.
Rohit Kanhai and Dr. Dennis Canterbury, let me bring the two of you in. Rohit, Professor Thomas makes a distinction between the universal basic income and what it's intended to do, and what this government is doing ostensibly under the name of providing resources to help people. Please, if you will, expand on that important point of a distinction between a real universal basic income proposal and what, in effect, the government is doing.
First of all, David, the government proposal trivializes what Dr. Thomas has proposed as a universal basic income. You know, there's a line in a prayer, give us our daily bread. I would say Dr. Thomas' proposal is ensuring that people who live under the poverty level will get their daily bread as a guarantee, which releases that energy to plan a future for themselves. I think that's a very important understanding of what the proposal is as compared to the government side, which is definitely a handout in any and every sense of the word. It does nothing to fundamentally change people's life in a meaningful way. So in that sense, I think it trivializes everything in relationship to the two proposals. More, I would also think that people who are just above the income level, the poverty level, can also plan their lives in meaningful way. You get education, which to me is very important. With the oil money, people need employment to access it, and that calls for a total revamping of the whole educational system so they can become professionals and access the oil money, thereby enhancing their standard of living. They're no longer consumed by basic bread and butter issues. You can now invest in your own development, education-wise for starters, and you can progress forward from that initial beginning.
Dr. Canterbury, the Buxton proposal in particular, but in general, proposals for cash transfers and universal basic income are aimed to alleviate poverty. Indeed, the UN Sustainability Goals, 2030 goals, number one, the first item on that is the use of universal basic income as a means of alleviating poverty. Make the relationship here between universal basic income / cash transfer and the alleviation of poverty.
Well, and the first thing I would like to say here is that what the PPP is doing in terms of making this payment is not a poverty reduction strategy. It's a political ploy. We all know this, as CY has pointed out. And the whole question of reduction of poverty, it can't be a haphazard sort of a approach. When we're going to address the question of poverty and how to reduce it, the United Nations and they're actually using now multidimensional approaches to it, the poverty reduction, which would include not only some things such as the universal, such as the Buxton proposal that we have on the table. Because if you look at it carefully, the Buxton proposal is not merely about paying monies out to people. It's multidimensional. It's about promoting employment. It's about having a steady income, as Rohit said, and as you have said earlier, and CY as well. It's about dealing with the environment. Because when you look at the millennium, at the goals, the 2030 agenda, we see poverty is number one on the list to sort of reduce. But then we also see the environment. And the Buxton proposal also is directly linked to creating the sort of situation whereby people who are not as poor in the poverty setting will not necessarily become engaged in the type of activities, economic activities that could destroy the environment, like forest, as farmers cutting the slash and burn agriculture and so on. So really, the paying out the cash transfer, a poverty reduction program, it's not a political program in terms of trying to get votes. The universal basic income is fully integrated. It must be integrated fully into a multidimensional approach, which we can use to help to raise the interest, the wage rate, wage and employment, increase employment. We could use it to tackle the environment. We could use it to do so many other aspects of that would address so many aspects of the people, poor people's lives and the society as a whole. Because when you take care of the environment, when you take care of the poor, you just lift the quality of the entire society, and it's not just the poor, because the environment affects all of us as well.
And that point you raise about the environment is particularly important. But let me get you to zero in a little bit. Here is a family in Golden Grove or Enterprise and more, or a family in Alshalton in the hinterland, and they get a cash transfer of let's say $1 million Guyana dollars. How can they? How is that injection of cash transfer going to help to lead them out of poverty? Give us a practical sense.
Yeah, that would be a very, very it would be much help. It would be a great help to them. It wouldn't solve all of their income problems, but what it can do is help them, especially if it has to be regular. It can't be.
Yeah. We're assuming that it's regular, because we're talking here now about the Buxton proposal, not the government handout.
Yes, right. It has to be regular, and once it's regular, then you can, as CY had pointed out before, as well as Rohit, you can plan on it. You can actually you could borrow in it to invest and make certain practical. You could buy a cow and a pig, and you could do some agriculture with it. You can you could also use it to for small business development, your own small businesses, and knowing that you're having a regular income, something on which you could now borrow and invest in you buy some goats or you buy sheep or the typical things that you could do. Poultry, you could do agriculture. You could also buy a sewing machine and stitch clothing for yourself and your family to reduce your costs. You could stitch clothing for people in the community and turn it into a small business. There are many sort of business aspects that we could see in this thing to help people to help themselves to get out of the poor situation that they're in. So there are many examples of this. We've seen this with this person who actually won the Nobel Prize for the small business development approach from Bangladesh, and where people microfinancing, right? Where people could actually take a small amount, take a money like $1 million Guyana dollars once it's regular, and then start small businesses. It's a good means to finance them like that. Besides, of course, helping to put food on the table for them. Because when we define poverty, we got to understand that poverty is defined in different ways. And so we could deal with those who are in abject poverty or absolute poverty, depending on your poverty level. Even to put food on the table would be actually helping to bring them out of poverty. So that because poverty is not is a relative term, and the way how we might define poverty in one place might not be the same in
another place. And of course, putting food on the table, they now would have the kind of income to put more nutritional food.
Precisely.
And that is a very important aspect. Let me go back to Professor Thomas. Professor Thomas, when you unveiled the Buxton proposal, of course, you did not invent the idea of a universal basic income. You were the first public person in Guyana to put it on the public agenda. In fact, there were high officials at that time who said they had never heard of the idea of a universal basic income. So what I want to ask you, because the vice president, as you said earlier, is saying that you were proposing giving each individual $1 million, when in fact you were proposing for each family, each household. But here is the question. He says that you did not put any thinking into it. You just threw out the figure. So what I want you to do here is to tell us what was your thinking. How did you arrive at that approximate figure at the time 6 years ago when you went to Buxton and unveiled what has now become known as the Buxton proposal? How did you arrive at that approximate figure?
Many people may not know it because they are not following my particular career in detail. But for a long period of time, I was an expert, considered to be an expert in poverty and income levels at that full level in Guyana. And I had written a number of papers and books. I was consulted on a number of projects all over the region. And based on that, I'd come to the recognition that if we were to ever get a windfall set of income from any source, one of the priorities that we should utilize right away for removing poverty as a significant scourge in Guyana is by getting a universal basic income. Of course, the idea was not new. It was as old as trade unionism. I was also, as many people might not know, was a member of the TUC General Council. I was an active trade unionist. And my studies in that area led me to believe that the main problem of Guyana within the region was that although we had a lot of resources, and a lot of it is commodity-based, although some of it is service-based, like natural resources, when for environmental tourism and that type of thing. The main difficulty we contend with is that our workers are known for being cheap labor. By cheap labor, I meant labor that you could pay anything to and they would work. Because people are hard up, particularly in the hard days. People are stealing your rubbish bins. People are stealing your lampposts, whatever it came to be. The needs were so great. And you could get people to work for literally cents at a time. And I realized that if we had a basic income being paid to people, this would increase the reserve price for labor. That it would have a higher income level at which it would be tempted to work or be willing to work. Put it that way, not tempted, be willing to work. That is, they were going to the market, place and offer their labor if the wages rose above a certain level. I call that the reserve price of labor. And if we gave a basic income to all these households, their reserve price of labor would rise. And people would not take what we used to take in those days. For income, I used to get $890 as a professor at UG. That was my pay. And that was one of the highest pays in Guyana. $890 Guyanese. People would not take that. But people had to work. And based on the income distribution in the country, the very low wage at the bottom of the income scale made people take anything because they could get nothing better. But if you raise the reserve price of labor, if you raise the opportunities that they could get out of a basic income, so they have to factor that in the price at which they sell their labor, pressure we put on the work, on the people buying labor, all these firms in Georgetown and these businessmen who are riding on the glory of Guyana's resources, wealth, will have to pay a higher price of labor. So I've always seen it as an incentive for the growth of the labor force, a well-paid labor force, as a growth for unionism and that type of thing. So it blended a lot of different streams of analysis and opportunities for me, for Guyanese. And that is why I support it.
Mm-hmm. And how did you arrive?
The amount was based on the levels of income at the time. Mm-hmm. Remember those times when we first noticed how bad the levels of poverty were. People measuring it as $1 a day, $1 US, which is now $200 or 206 or something like that. So it was a very, very low income base. And gradually this base started to rise. And a lot of the rise out of it, I think it was accompanied by an expansion in the ability of people to only accept labor at a minimum price or a reserve price that was giving them certain basics. And that is what go on.
No, I was about to say, so that was one factor. The other factors, I remember it, had to do with your projection of our oil reserves. And
but that came later.
It is very, because I had GHK Lal on my program a couple of nights ago, and he said, look, I was wrong, and Professor Thomas got it right. And he was making reference to the projection as to how much oil reserves we had. Because when the proposal was laid, most of them, including Jack Dew, said we can never, ever pay out that amount.
We have been writing, some of the leading writers
on
the topic in Guyana. I have been writing, where they said we can never, ever have more than 1.3 million barrels of oil in the ground. Billion barrels of oil. I have that in writing.
Yes. And so when you made the proposal,
they were all laughing and said,
what was your projection at that time?
I used the United States Geological Services projection. You see, many people don't know it. They write and they don't do research. There's a distinction between the two. And it's very important if you want to be a writer. You have to know the facts. The United States Geological Services had done a survey of undiscovered geological sites for oil. And they done a model and a global survey in 2000 and repeated in 2012. I happened to get both copies. I got both copies. And I looked at this region and they were projecting that for the Guyana-Caribbean basin as a medium projection, 50% probability, it'll be 13 to 15 billion. And I took a gamble on that. But it turned out that probability was surpassed in the sense that as more and more discoveries are made, you can go for a higher probability that it will be successful based on the past creaming curve, which is the curve of discoveries. And based on that, I've advanced it to estimate at 28 to 30 billion, which are in my Starbuck News columns over the period. And I show reasons why I did that and how you move up the distribution curve and all the various analyses that are required for that. And I've used that. But I've been happy in that Exxon has stuck to their 11 plus billion. The government has introduced a new PSA, a new production sharing agreement to advertise the public auctions. And I hope they know what they're doing. They actually stated in that advertisement that the resources were 25 billion barrels of oil. That came about 6 months after me. So that's pretty close. So I have at least an official source that is in my proximity, but no other source comes close to it. Although some investors in the US market are recommending that they may have, in fact, about 20 billion, which I also cite. But you got to pay to get advice from the firms. So I'm not disclosing it and so somebody just get it free.
Professors, I remember it at the time, and I was on the stage with you when you made that first proposal, as the old people would say. I was there. You just did not throw out a figure of 5,000 US dollars.
Of course not.
Alternatively, you talk about a percentage of the revenues that come in, and I remember you would have thrown out about 10%. Do you still hold to that formula?
Well, I think it has to be updated because of what has been taking place over the last 5 to 6 years since it was made. The exchange rate has shifted a little bit. It's appreciated slightly in Guyana. The price levels have increased so that the real value of the currency, both in Guyana and in the US, because remember it's structured on the US dollar.
Yes.
And then converted properly. It's $1.05 million. Not 1 million, but I mean, we don't fight over the couple of 100,000.
Professor Clive Thomas, in case you're just joining us.
But before I got sick when stopped the articles at Starbuck News, I was in fact just about to recalculate the new figure that I would use. But people know the principle which is done. I try to adjust it in terms of exchange rate changes, price changes in the US and Guyana market, and use a convenient figure. Because in these arguments, convenience is more important than a precise figure. I want to use something like 3.7645321. And so before they say 4. You know, it's easy for people to remember 3 and 4.
In case you're just joining us, yes, Politics 101. Tonight we are discussing all things economics on our Open Word edition, and we have here Professor Clive Thomas, whose voice you just heard there. Alongside him is Rohit Kanhai, co-leader of the Working People's Alliance, and Dr. Dennis Canterbury, chairman of the WPA Policy Committee and executive member. Rohit, let me bring you in. You, Dennis, and myself, we all grew up in the WPA reading Bread and Justice. And I know of no other person who cites that little booklet, I call it at that time, by Clive Thomas, written since in the 1970s. Let me ask you, how relevant are the arguments and the principles enshrined in that book, Bread and Justice? How relevant it is today to our discourse on the oil and gas resources and how we can use them to alleviate or reduce poverty?
David, the line that has stuck in my head all these years is bread, or more correctly, the promise of bread cannot be traded for justice. And that spells out precisely what we're dealing with between Dr. Thomas' proposal and the trivialization of it by the PPP. Now, as Dr. Thomas has just said, he has a very long history, and this is prior to oil. He wrote Bread and Justice. He wrote The Poor and the Powerless, The Role of the Authoritarian State in Peripheral Societies, and Dependence on Transformation. I have read all those texts, and they're very impressive. And this is prior to oil. Now they become even more relevant in the post-oil economy that we're dealing with. And the need for justice is the key element right now. This is a Guyanese resource. It belongs to all of Guyana. This is not something that belongs to a government of Guyana that currently does not represent the way we participate in a so-called political democracy. Does not represent the people as such. And we have to also fight for a government that represents the total electorate. Every individual that votes in Guyana has the right to vote, must participate in the distribution of that oil wealth. It doesn't belong to any government and hand it out to people as if it's a boon from a king to, the subjects. So Dr. Thomas' proposal reasserts a right of Guyanese to what is their patrimony, to develop themselves through what rightfully belongs to them. And that is why, tied into the very discussion of justice, that we must have a political system that is truly a national government, which is also part of the political struggle we're involved in. Now, I would also point out, Kwame Nkrumah said, seek ye first the political kingdom, and all things will be added unto you. That is straight from the Bible. But then there is a spiritual component that says without justice, that distribution will not go well. And I think that's encapsulated in Dr. Thomas, bread, or more correctly, the promise of bread cannot be traded for justice.
And of course, the reduction and ultimate alleviation of poverty is in itself social justice. As you are arguing, and as Thomas argued in the 1970s, social justice, environmental justice, it's all tied up in that, because if we can reduce poverty, if we can set the energies of our people unbounded from poverty, then we open up the possibilities for a more just society. Dr. Dennis Canterbury, we have had the debate whether the individual or the family / the household is the way to go when we are dealing with the cash transfer. Those of us who have been thinking about the universal basic income would know that that very notion is grounded. It's grounded in the notion of the family as a unit. And Clive at the beginning says that, if you say I'm giving it to every voter, there's no unit to ground it in. Why? Expand on my introduction there. Why using the family as a unit as opposed to the individual is more beneficial in terms of reducing poverty?
Well, I should say before we get started on this question that CY talked about him having a long history of focusing on the question of poverty. I remember that we actually put together a special issue of the journal that we published at UG, something called Transition. We have a special issue entitled Poverty in Guyana Finding Solutions. And I'm sure CY remembers this. And we did this in 1992 when there was a change in government. And we had this big meeting and brought in all of these different sectors, and people spoke from different aspects of poverty in Guyana. And we did this and we handed it to the PPP, to Jagan, as a contribution for him to sort of see some ideas about how they might tackle poverty. But none of it sort of, it wasn't an election ploy, as we see that is happening here now, where you would want to give to individuals as distinct from the family. Because basically, when we put together Poverty in Guyana Finding Solutions, we were thinking about how to help the very people that CY mentioned earlier, as well as Rohit, the Guyanese households, Guyanese families, poor people. Basically, how to find solutions to the problems that they've had. I remember I myself, I wrote in that thing something on rural poverty, something that and I actually drew a poverty line for another study I did on rural poverty in Guyana. So estimated the poverty line. Now, so you're always dealing with the family and the household as distinct from the individual.
And why is the family the preferable unit?
Because the family is the basic unit in the society, and the family is sort of we could actually construct some sort of an approach to helping a household move out of its poor conditions, rather than use the individual. Because if you notice, we all came from families. This is the way we came from. So it's the family that's the most basic unit in a society. And that's the unit that we're trying to, with the Boxing proposal, help to bring them out of poverty, as distinct from using individuals. The individual approach that was suggested by some of our people on the other side is by the government and by the former finance minister. We could see how that is going to be used to encourage corruption. We can see how that is going to be used to as an election ploy to win voters, and especially, as you pointed out earlier, that you have reports that they actually want the voters list in order to implement that policy. To implement that policy, that is a policy that is going to it's not even a policy. It's just a political approach to win votes. That's what it is. Because if you're going to have a real poverty reduction strategy, you need to study so many things. You need all kinds of information. Which are the groups of people you're attacking? What's the difference between poverty in the Rupununi and poverty in the East Coast and poverty in Georgetown? So you need lots of understanding of how poverty works in terms of how we define it and how we can come to understand what it is, as distinct from just saying you're going to give $100,000 to every individual. And then we don't even know what is the individual. And then you say, okay, it's going to be 18 years and above. And then you don't know about the issues that we raised last week, that you raised, David, with respect to a woman who is 17 years old with 2 kids. So if you deal with the family, you take care of all of those kinds of problems, because you can have single parent family, you can have a family with 2 husband and wife, or common law family, all kinds of family structure, all kinds of family types you can have. And one of the important things that we should really try not to overlook is a point that Clive made last week. This whole question of the struggle that the very PPP carried out, Dr. Jagan, for recognition for Hindu marriages and the Hindu family. Because remember, the colonials never used to give to certain people certain benefits, but they never recognized the wedding, the marriage under quote unquote bamboo.
Bamboo, yes, they used to call it.
So they had a struggle to get the family recognized. And now, Dr. Jagan wrote about it in his book, The West on Trial. And now the very PPP is saying, let us go with individuals rather than the family, which you had to struggle hard to get them to recognize the family.
Dr. Dennis Canterbury, executive member of the WPA, himself a political sociologist, economic sociologist. We now deal with interdisciplinarity, and he is chairman of the Working People's Alliance Policy Committee. You all have heard it. The clear distinction between the Buxton proposal that is being put forward by the WPA and what the PPP is doing. The objective of our proposal is to reduce poverty, to help you out of poverty. The objective of what the PPP is doing is to give you a small piece to get a vote, and they're not interested in reducing poverty. That is the distinction, and we wanted to make that patently clear that our proposal is aimed at reducing poverty. One of the things that Jack Dio did is to say Clive Thomas is good at writing university papers. Well, you have to write in university papers call for intellectual acumen. And I want Mr. Jagdio to produce a piece of paper with his name next to it to demonstrate his acumen. Who talks off the top of their head more than the vice president? One of the things we have always known in dealing with Clive Thomas, he don't talk on the top of your head. He always say, you have to study this thing. And the next thing he always tell us, I don't lie. Let the numbers, let the studies speak for themselves. So we want to make that clear. Professor Thomas, as I come back to you, sugar is in the air again. And this is an area, you mentioned your expertise or your being regarded as an in poverty. As a small boy in Buxton, learn from the farmers in the village that you were an expert on sugar, because I always tell the story of whenever you come to speak in the village, the farmers would come out to the back dam early, go home, bathe the skin, put on the nice clothes and sit down on the line top waiting. And we as young boys, we wanted to hear the firebrands, but they would come when you speak, and later on they schooled me. They said, teacher, what Dr. Thomas talk about? A cane farming. He talking about vegetable farming. He talking about wheat life, so we could identify with that. I say that to say, see why you're also an expert on sugar. Sugar is in the air again. Gaisuku, trouble. They're not even producing 40% of the projection. And today, what, 300,000 tons of cane sugar is what they're projecting, and they're not even meeting that. Government is still pumping billions of dollars into the industry. Gavu, the union, said they are concerned. They're changing managers left, right, and center. You were the chairman of the board when the coalition government came into. There was a commission of inquiry, and you advised the government based on the commission of inquiry. We know what happened there. Why are we still, after all these years, talking about Gaisuku and the sugar industry being a failure?
Well, I think for many reasons. And perhaps the most important of all is that it is, in fact, a very difficult problem to solve. I think the industry as it's constructed, as it operates now, is completely uneconomic. The gap between the price of sugar and the cost of production is so wide that every effort we make to try to subsidize rice to make it a profit-making institution will result in those resources that we pump into sugar being used to subsidize the price at which Demerara sugar is sold in Europe and in North America. I hate to say that we are, on this course that we're pursuing now, hell-bent on subsidizing consumers in Europe and North America, and not Guyanese. So it's wasted surplus. To my mind, it's criminal to be discussing that we can't find enough money for the popular proposal and giving all that surplus that we get from the windfall incomes in oil to people in Europe and North America as a subsidy for the continued consumption of our sugar. Sugar can never be economic on the scale and the way in which it is currently operated. Right? Sugar has to be turned into a completely different mechanism. Following the Commission of Inquiry a decade ago, when I was chairman, we made a great effort to try and convert Gaisuku into a holding company, much as Booker's was before it came to operate as the leading sugar producer in Guyana, where we would develop parts of the industry to be self-centered or self-organized profit-making institutions. We took, for example, the possibility of making the sugar, the estate's drainage system, the ponds and the operations of the sugar equipment and the rivers and so on, into fish farms. We got the best consultants in the world, including some from Florida, from the university. We had a feasibility study about to be completed when I no longer was there. I don't know if it's completed yet. To try to see if we could find a basis on what types of fish to produce for that market what were the requirements of the American European taste, what weight they had to be, all the conditionalities that were needed to make it a popular sell in Europe. We got this, we looked at the stalks, the cane that is actually grown. We got into discussions with an investor from France. In fact, the same investor who was producing the heart of palm. We were to make briquettes so that they would use that in the heating season in Europe. And we expected that because it was organic, we would get much better sales because there is non-toxicity and the opportunities that would present for us as a solid market, with him leading the introduction into the market. We even had experts look at the antiquities of the sugar industry and the estates in Kaisuku, because we were advised by experts that all that thing we call junk, including the railway line that we nationalized and abandoned, would make a very valuable source of antiquities for sale in the European and North American market, where the price was paid based on the scarcity of value of the items we found. He came down several times to visit us, and we thought that we were making successive progress in that way. We got consultants to convert the agricultural sector and the housing and equipment that it had into some form of tourism, where we would rent the estate houses and some of the facilities and like that to locals or to people from the region, because they were pretty well appointed, majestic homes, high stairways. You would never imagine the luxury and existence in some of that architecture of the estate years. So we did a lot of things in relation to that. We had agricultural tourism being planned, because we realized that sugar could not survive on its own. So we converted into a holding company. These other industries that we're talking about would be spin-offs, but would be profit-making spin-offs. And the sugar industry will be turned into basically producing the essential sugar we needed for domestic consumption, maybe a little bit for the market in the West Indies, West Indies Sugar Association, and for some firms that were highly dependent on Guyana sugar for their operations, like the liquids and so on, produced by some of the firms selling soft drinks and things like that, alcohol, wines and rum and so on. So that was the model we had. But we knew that this cannot be turned around on a dime. The estate was a big albatross over everybody's necks. You can't turn around a thing as complex as that in the space of a year. It would take a few years, and we needed the commitment and the support of the politicians to make it possible. The commission of inquiry that the government set up prior to this had charted the way forward and gave us in the board, I was chairman, non-executive chairman, the way in which we would operate that industry and how we'd work. Midway into that, the sugar farm started complaining. Kaisuku had that problem to deal with the workers, getting workers. We had to close. Some estates came up as becoming unnecessary, like Wales and that type of thing, because of the way in which the sugar was being processed, then the cane into sugar. Hard decisions had to be made. And the politicians all panicked. And Holder, who was our minister, was put in a tight spot because he could never please his colleagues. So eventually he yielded to pressure. And we never pursued the efforts. But I can tell you that we can never, ever make progress with that sugar industry as long as the political challenges remain as they are. And people fight for vested interests over it. It has to be a collaborative effort of all governments, stakeholders, including the opposition, who are formal parts of the government as the opposition. So we have to have an all-party agreement to work on Kaisuko to change it. Other than that, it's a funnel for you wasting the surplus that we get from oil. So I totally oppose any effort to try to make it a success. It can't ever be. The gap between cost and the price we get in the world market is too huge. The cost is more than double the price at which we sell the sugar, even in the protected markets.
Mm-hmm.
You can't ever get out of that. So what is happening in 1 year it may get a little bit of success because the rains and the infrastructure might hold up and you get a good harvest and you get some good money. But that would never be enough to cover even that year's expenditure. And we have a backlog of debt that is humongous. When I was there, it was billions of dollars. And I'm sure by now it's probably approaching 100 billion if I'm not going to be exaggerating.
Yeah. Your party, the Working People's Alliance, we have called that saying that we would support a decade after that commission of inquiry, we would support a new commission of inquiry.
I think that's a sensible thing to do. Because what we need more than ever is a political consensus to solve the problem. Because once people begin to tug at it, because remember it's an important voting base for the PPPC. So they will always be wanting to be opportunistic in relation to it.
Opportunistic in relation to it. Rohit Kanhai and Dennis Canterbury, as we wind down this program, your closing thoughts.
You know, listening to CY talking about the sugar industry, I remember the days when we, at the specific day when you went to the natural sciences faculty at UG to deliver a talk on the threat and the challenge, on the sugar sucrochemistry. And I remember you telling them then, this was, I think was in the 1970s, if I'm not mistaken. You were saying to them, look, we need to get out of sugar and we need to do just as you just said there. This was in the 1970s. So you wrote a book about it, and that book called The Threat or the Challenge. At first, we used to call it The Threat or the Promise. But when it published, it came as Threat and the Challenge. And the subtitle was, I think, The Economics of the Sucrochemistry
Industry, yeah.
Economics of the sucrochemistry industry. And the idea was that you can use the sugarcane plant, not as a
No, you can use the plant.
Yeah, but
you can use it for grass and
these are the things
with the chemicals.
Right?
But basically, it can be structured, and you get to the sugar part of it, which is alcohol based, and that can make any chemical in it.
Right. And
so anything you want, whether it's petrol, whether it's lipstick, whether it's grease for skin, whatever it is, all can be made from sugar.
And the recommendation you made to the guys was that they should start to teach a course in sucrochemistry.
Chemistry, yeah.
But I don't even believe that they teach sucrochemistry in the region, because
that book was published in English. That book was published in English, Portuguese, Spanish,
and in fact, they tried to. I read an article where they said you should be nominated for a Nobel Prize for economics for writing on the economics of sucrochemistry. I remember the article back then in the Caribbean Contact. I think was P.I. Gomes wrote it, and saying that there was kind of a move in the region to get you nominated for the Nobel Prize in Economics based off of that study and some others that you did, because they don't give it for this one book. But
Right. Rohit Kanhai, your closing thoughts?
Dr. Thomas just mentioned the word political consensus. Now, if we go back to 1976, I think we had a $276 million emerging from the sugar windfall.
Yeah.
And there was a huge debate whether that money should go to the sugar workers versus other section of the economy. And the bauxite industry was one of those industries at the time. What it shows us that Guyana has to think ahead. Culturally, politically, we have been faced with certain problems. But sometimes the problems are not localized. In the case of the sugar industry, we are affected by forces outside of Guyana. And we now have to find ways and means of adjusting the whole economic structure of Guyana to survive. We're faced with the same problem with oil and sugar now. Should we subsidize the sugar industry through the oil economy? As Dr. Thomas just pointed out, it's almost an impossibility. So as long as we do not find a political consensus, we will have everything to divide us on political grounds. So I think the most important thing is a political consensus, which will force us with the oil money. How do we arrive at a political consensus when it comes to the distribution of oil resources on an equitable basis, having political consensus?
Rohit Kanhai, co-leader of the WPA, Dr. Dennis Canterbury, chairman of the WPA's policy committee, and Professor Clive Thomas, who needs no introduction. Gentlemen, thank you all so much for coming on to this week's edition of Politics 101, the open word edition, where we talk anything that has to do with economics. But economics is not just a singular discipline. It is rooted, of course, in our socio-political and cultural realities. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, David.
And to your audience, we continue to do what we are called upon to do at this juncture in our history. We are faced with challenges, but those challenges can be surmounted. And we continue to bring information to you and to bring the kind of analysis that goes along with the information. Ultimately, our objective is justice. Justice for the impoverished people, moving them out of poverty. Justice for our national community, because as post-plantation societies, we still have a destiny. And that destiny is to shrug off ultimately all the vestiges of colonialism and slavery that went before. Our task is a heavy task, but it's not a burden that we cannot carry to its logical conclusion. We continue to do it. Tomorrow night, I'm going to analyze the American election, and I hope to have some friends with me to do that. But for now, as you know, we say we love you. And that love comes from a sense of community, a sense of our Guyanese-ness, and very importantly, a sense of our Caribbean-ness. We're not giving up on the Caribbean because we are part of that larger family. Good night, and I'll see you all tomorrow night.
One race from the same place that make the same trip on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region, for we women and we children. That must be the ambition of the Caribbean.